meeting this morning. And this is, of course, the penultimate session. This is the 7th in the series of our technical webinar. And I would like to, on all our behalf, extend a very warm welcome to our presenters this morning. Today, we are very, very fortunate indeed that we have with us Her Excellency, Ms. Simona Marinescu, the United Nations Resident Coordinator for Samoa, the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau, who is leading a work on behalf of the resident coordinators in SIDS on this very important task in developing, contributing to this discussion on the development of the MVIs, together, of course, with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, whom we are so privileged also to have with us present this morning, and they will be participating and delivering and making presentations to us. Professor Sachs, of course, is leading the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. A very good morning to the both of you, particularly Simona. We know that this is a very odd hour back in the Pacific. Now, we also have with us today, we're very fortunate to have the UNESCO, representatives from the UNESCO. They're also making presentations. We have with us the chief of the SIDS sections, natural science sector, Ms. Zulmira Rodriguez. And we also have Ms. Dr. Vladimir Rabanin, the Executive Secretary and Assistant Director General, Intergovernmental and Oceanographic Commission of the OIC. We also have Ms. Paola Leozzini Bartoli, the Director, Cultural Policies and Development in the Cultural Sector, and Ms. Aureliane Dumont, the Associate Project Officer, Division of Water Science, Intergovernmental Hydrological Program from UNESCO. From the team from UNESCO, welcome very much to our presentation today. And lastly, we also have the privilege and the pleasure to be participating and making presentations, 3 presentations this morning, is our colleague, Mr. Matthias Bruckner. He is, of course, the Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the Secretariat of the Development Policies at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Matthias, you're very welcome indeed today. So to all our distinguished presenters, we're looking forward to your presentations, and to all our participants, we are again echoing our earlier invitation for an interactive dialogue. Dissenting is welcomed, but we will do it so in a manner that will be of assistance to our joint task, and that is to come up with a set of genuine and good recommendations by the Secretary General on this multi-vulnerability, the multi-dimensional vulnerability index for small island developing states. With those few opening remarks, Ms. Thomas, I now give back the floor to you to please moderate today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sai. And we are going to jump right in. I think Sai has adequately taken the introduction. Simona, I would just ask you to quickly go through the team that will be presenting this morning, and let us begin, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anya. Thank you so much, Sai, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning from Samoa, where is indeed the top of the morning. My mission is going to be very easy. I'm introducing our great partners into the development of the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, and then, of course, pass on the floor. But allow me first to thank UNDESA and OHR-LLS for allowing the resident coordinators of the small island developing states to embark on this knowledge sharing process. We have started early on working on a multidimensional vulnerability index in mid-2020, when the first letter of the Alliance of Small Island States came to the United Nations requesting support for the development of the MVI. We thought we would make a good contribution to this process, as we are the resident coordinators bringing UN teams in small island states in the implementation of the Samoa pathway. Samoa, the government of Samoa still has great attachment and commitment to the Samoa pathway, and then bringing our analytical capacity that the United Nations reform has enabled. We put together our thoughts. We've started looking at multidimensional vulnerability as a resilience deficit. We had multiple iterations of our analysis until we realized that we needed a strong partner So we have been extremely successful in bringing on board a partner that allows us to have the academic review, the strong technical input into the development of the multidimensional vulnerability index. And I'm referring to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, university professor at Columbia University. He doesn't need any introduction. Together with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Guillaume Lafortune, the SDG Index Manager, and Dr. Isabella Massa, who is our direct counterpart in SDSN, working on the Sustainable Development Solutions Network on the MVI. I will just conclude by saying that we are eager to be part of this process. We learned a lot by listening to webinars in which others presented. We believe that our perspectives from the field matter, and I'm quite sure that with the support of UNDESA and OHRLLS, we will have finally a product that small island developing states will find suitable, and international financial institutions that others will accept. With that, it is my great privilege, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, to give you the floor. And again, I would like to mention that Professor Sachs has granted his time and knowledge and guidance to us as a pro bono contributor to the process. Very grateful, Professor Sachs, and the network is 24/7 with us in the development of the index. Professor Sachs, over to you. Thank you.
Simona, thank you very much, and colleagues, thank you very much. It's an honor to be working together with you, and really a great cause and a very interesting cause as well. I think the reason that we are all working to develop new metrics, and especially this multidimensional vulnerability index, is the recognition that small island developing states need a different kind of financing. That's one of the motivations for developing the MVI to begin with. I think one of the original motivations was to argue, don't graduate us even when we hit a particular per capita income. We have special vulnerabilities, and therefore we shouldn't be graduated in the typical way on the typical formula for developing countries receiving concessional aid. I would recommend we think even beyond that, to say what the SIDS need in a well-formulated way is a global partnership development strategy that recognizes the unique circumstances of small island developing states. And so what we're really trying to propose is a framework that shows not only the added vulnerabilities, but explains what's special about small island developing states that requires a different kind of approach for those countries to achieve sustainable development. And to my mind, the small island developing states have at least three characteristics, maybe more, that are highly distinctive. One is they are small. Second, they are islands. Third, to an important extent, they are somewhat remote in terms of trade, though to a varying extent. And there may be other distinctive elements to bring into the picture. But I believe that we should go with the structural base of the argument and say, given these fundamental realities, we need a fundamentally tailored approach for small island developing states. Now, by small, not every one of the SIDS has a population of under 1 million, say, but most have a very small population. And that means intrinsically that the economies are not highly diversified, especially in their exports. It means they tend to be very dependent on either energy or food imports or other basic imported needs, and highly vulnerable to trade disruptions or terms of trade shocks. And so we see a lot of volatility in trade, a lot of disruption, as we've seen with COVID-19, where many of the countries are tourism dependent and tourism collapsed during COVID-19. But That's both a symptom and a characteristic of being small. You depend on one sector or two sectors, and that means a high vulnerability and a high volatility. By virtue of being islands, all of our countries share certain characteristics. The first definition is you can't bring low-cost goods and services over land. And so a lot of the basic needs have to be found at home for water, and many of the islands are water stressed. And similarly, many of the islands are very low-lying islands that are highly vulnerable to rising sea levels. And by virtue of being in the open ocean, many, though not all of the islands, are highly vulnerable to major tropical storms, especially hurricanes or typhoons, and therefore are suffering especially high risks and costs of adaptation from climate change. So this is a second characteristic. Being islands, there are extra burdens. Being small islands, you have that combination of vulnerability. A third dimension that is especially the case of the Pacific Islands, though to an important extent of the islands in the Indian Ocean and in the Atlantic coastal islands of Africa, less so in the Caribbean, is distance from major markets. And the Pacific Island economies are really far away from trade. Being an island doesn't guarantee high trade costs. If you are the island of Singapore, you actually have the lowest trade costs because the world's major sea route is you. And that means that the condition of Singapore, since its founding by Raffles as a trading center for the British Empire, has been an extremely profitable, low trade cost area. But think of Tonga or Samoa or the Pacific Islands, which are thousands of kilometers away from markets. The trade costs are among the highest in the world. The Caribbean is different because the Caribbean is close to the US market. That is a benefit from trade costs. It is a curse in other ways. It involves these societies in US drug trafficking and in violence and US arms trafficking and shipments. But from a trade cost point of view, the costs are not the same as the Pacific Islands. So our analysis suggests three different geographic groups of SIDS, to keep it simple: the Caribbean, the Pacific, and what we call the Indian Ocean / Atlantic, which are mainly around coastal Africa or near India, Maldives, Mauritius, and so forth, and then the Atlantic coastal islands, and three categories of distinctiveness. One relates to economic vulnerabilities from small size. The second relates to environmental vulnerabilities as islands that face hydrometeorological or seismic shocks. And the third is remoteness, which is especially the case for the Pacific Islands, also the case for the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic islands, to a lesser extent of the Caribbean islands. And our analytics, which Isabella is going to discuss in a moment, then looks at how the different groupings of the islands relate to these three different dimensions of vulnerability. And they differ according to which region of the SIDS we're talking about and which one of the vulnerabilities. But then I think it behooves us, and then we show these islands really are distinctive compared to the rest of the world on these various dimensions. There really is a SIDS category that makes sense, not just in the trivial sense, but in the economic development sense. The outcomes for the SIDS are adversely impacted by these three dimensions of remoteness, small size, and island environmental vulnerabilities. That's easily demonstrated. And then finally, I think that the answer that we're seeking is, so what? What do we do in view of this kind of vulnerability? I think it's more than just saying, don't graduate us from aid. I think it is, we need a development strategy that makes life viable in our societies, enables us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, enables us to adjust to the special shocks of climate that we didn't cause, but which we suffer. And so I would say we need three kinds of funding mechanisms that result from this consideration. We need essentially a climate fund for the SIDS that relates to the very high costs of adaptation that these countries are going to incur, no fault of their own. Second, we need an economic development fund, which takes into account the small size, the lesser diversification, and therefore particular difficulties of meeting infrastructure, digital access, universal electrification, water, which is a major challenge. But to identify what are these challenges, and then the incremental funding, the billions of dollars needed for this. And then I think the Pacific Islands are really sui generis in important ways. They are so small in population, so distant, indigenous populations, many particular challenges. We need a Pacific Island framework. It's not so hard to do, in my view, because it's not such a huge population after all, but to ensure decent lives for people in the Pacific Islands requires specific attention to the unique circumstances of those countries and their unique history as well. History of a lot of colonial abuse, or history of being subjected to Western diets that are probably genetically deeply ill-advised, but have led to massive ill health and so forth. In other words, look at the real circumstances and say, don't lump us together, but we need a development strategy that reflects these unique circumstances. So just to finish, my view is that the MVI is not only a technical tool, it's a demonstration of a development pathway that is needed, that should be tailored to the unique structural conditions of these countries. That is the spirit of SDG 17, global partnership to achieve the SDGs everywhere, to leave no one behind, to leave no country behind. And what our index work can do, by our, I mean the whole UN community index work together can do, is to say, look, SIDS were identified as a separate group because they have separate structural needs, and financing is a core part of those separate structural needs. And that involves environmental financing, economic development financing, and financing that recognizes the remarkable remoteness of certain countries and the need to respond effectively to that. So that's the philosophy in which we have been proceeding. I will stop there, knowing that Isabel is going to show you some of the data that goes along with this kind of reasoning.
Thank you so much, Professor Sachs. I'll give the floor to Isabella. She has a few slides. Colleagues, be patient with us. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present. Isabella, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Thank you, Simona, and thanks also to Endesa for giving us the opportunity to share to such an audience our preliminary results of the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index. So I'm going to share my screen for presenting some slides that we have prepared. So, as Professor Sachs just mentioned, SIDS are a unique group of countries. They share some common inherent characteristics, but at the same time, they are a very heterogeneous group of countries. So, as mentioned by Professor Sachs, if we think about remoteness, we can see that the Pacific and Atlantic Indian SIDS are very remote. And especially more remote than the Caribbean countries that instead are closer to the continent. So for the purposes of our work, we thought that it was important to classify SIDS into different regional clusters. And in particular, we distinguished between 3 different SIDS regional clusters: the Pacific one, the Atlantic Indian SIDS region, and the Caribbean SIDS region. Now, the focus of our work is, of course, on vulnerability, and more specifically on structural vulnerability. So we define vulnerability as any structural limitation which impedes to achieve sustainable development. And in order to measure vulnerability, we look at 3 different dimensions. We look at the dimension of economic vulnerabilities, the dimension of structural development limitations, as well as the dimension of environmental vulnerabilities. So, as many of you know, the main challenge is to find the adequate variables to measure these dimensions. Some variables are rather straightforward, but in some cases we need to rely on proxies to be able to measure certain aspects related to vulnerabilities. So here I'm going to present the list of variables that have been included in our current draft version of the MVI. But please keep in mind that this is a work in progress, and therefore we will continue in the following days and weeks to refine our MVI in terms of the number as well as the type of variables that are going to be included in the final version on the MVI. So I will talk about this in a while, but for example, there are certain variables such as geographic dispersion that is not included yet, but this is something that is under discussion, and together with this variable we are going to discuss also about the inclusion of other possible variables. So for the time being, if we focus on the dimension of economic vulnerabilities, the variables that we have included under the economic vulnerability pillar are variables that reflect the degree of economic diversification of a country, in particular the export concentration index. We included trade openness. We included a number of variables related to the income dependency of a country from abroad, and specifically the share of remittances over GDP, the share of tourism over tourism receipts over GDP, as well as ODA as a share of GDP. And then we also look at the degree of dependency of a country on strategic imports, and in particular on food imports as a share of total merchandise imports, and fuel imports as a share of total merchandise imports. Now, moving on the structural development limitation dimension, here we focus more on certain, let's say, geographic constraints of countries. So we take into account the physical size as measured by population, location that refers to the remoteness of a country by relying on 2 variables, the ship connectivity index as well as the chief fob ratio that is used as a proxy of transport costs. And we also included a measure of internal renewable water availability in a country, and also arable land. Now, regarding the environmental vulnerability, we mainly focus on the frequency and the severity of natural disasters. And here I would like to highlight once again what Professor Sachs has also said, that we distinguish also between hydrometeorological natural disasters, such as floods, drought, and storms, for example, and seismic disasters that refer mainly to volcanic activity or earthquakes. We also wanted to include a variable that could reflect to some extent the vulnerability to sea level rise issues, and for this reason we included the land area where elevation is below 5 meters. So before presenting the very preliminary results that we have on our MVI, I would like to clarify that, of course, the focus of this work is on SIDS, but given that we would like to understand where exactly SIDS are positioned compared to the rest of the world, we tried to include in our index as many countries as possible. And for this reason, our draft MVI covers 196 countries, both developed and developing countries, of which 46 are SIDS. And we consider SIDS which are UN members as well as SIDS which are non-UN members. So in the table that is reported in this slide, you can see the outcome of regressing our MVI against the different regions all over the world, including the 3 SIDS regional clusters. So if you have a look at the coefficients of the different regions, you can easily see that SIDS are more vulnerable than all the other countries in the world. And why this is the case? Because if you look at the coefficients of all the 3 SIDS regional clusters, you can see that these coefficients are positive and are mainly much more significant and with higher, significantly higher values than all the coefficients of the other regions all around the world. Now, we have been doing a similar exercise also with respect to the 3 different pillars, the dimension I was speaking about before of our MVI. And here, for space reasons, I reported just the results with respect to the SIDS regional clusters, but of course the regressions have been run taking into account all the other regions in the world. So which are the main takeaways of these regressions? In a nutshell, the main finding is that the type of vulnerability of the 3 regional clusters of SIDS varies, which means that we might have SIDS that are highly exposed economically from an economic perspective, but it might be the case that there are other SIDS that instead are more exposed to environmental shocks or that face particularly important development constraints. In particular, when looking at the coefficients that we got from our regressions, what it emerged is that Pacific SIDS appears to be the most vulnerable across all the pillars, so in the economic, development, and environmental dimensions as well. Pacific SIDS, together with the Atlantic Indian SIDS, seem to be particularly vulnerable economically, while both Pacific SIDS and Caribbean SIDS result to be particularly vulnerable to environmental shocks. Then when focusing on the Atlantic and Indian SIDS, what we found is that it seems that this group of SIDS on the Atlantic and Indian Ocean faced probably the most significant development constraints. So once that we built our draft MVI, we wanted also to see how vulnerability relates to a battery of outcomes. So to see which is the relationship between the vulnerability of a country against certain dimensions, such as, for example, well-being, poverty, the GDP, the SDG index. So in this slide, you can see the relationship between our draft MVI index and the SDG index. So what you can see is that there is a negative relationship between the draft MVI index and the SDG index, pointing out that a higher degree of vulnerability is associated with a lower SDG index performance. We have done a similar exercise also with respect to other outcome variables. So, for example, with the poverty, and again, it results that being vulnerable is associated with higher SDG gaps in poverty. We also found that being vulnerable is associated with higher SDG gaps in well-being. And finally, that being vulnerable is associated with higher SDG gaps in health outcomes, as shown by the negative relationship existing between our draft MVI index and the SDG life expectancy index. So to conclude, I think that our work confirmed that small island developing states are a unique group of countries, a distinct group that face specific structural vulnerabilities, ranging from economic to development and environmental vulnerabilities. But more importantly, there are important differences in the type of vulnerability faced by the different regional clusters of SIDS. And so what does this imply? It has a very important implication because it means that SIDS need specific financing support. And this financing support should be tailored to their specific vulnerabilities, as previously suggested and highlighted by Professor Sachs. To conclude, I would also like to share with you a view that we developed undertaking this work over the last weeks and months, and mainly the fact that we know very well that gathering data is always challenging, but we realize that this is particularly and extremely challenging in the context of SIDS. We are realizing that data for certain SIDS are not available. Sometimes they are of poor quality. So we really believe that better data for developing countries, but specifically in our case for SIDS, are needed. And this is important not only for us and for all the other people working on vulnerability indices to refine our indices, but also to be able to assess the government efforts to strengthen resilience and public sector capacities to respond to shocks and vulnerabilities. So we acknowledge and we know that institutional, social and governance aspects are key, especially for SIDS, but we also know that data availability on these aspects is unfortunately sometimes very poor when dealing with SIDS. And so we really would like to call for better data on certain aspects that we cover with our MVI, but also on these institutional and social aspects, because this will be key to improve the multidimensional vulnerability index and also to have a better picture of the degree of resilience that SIDS can achieve. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Isabella. This concludes our part. Just to say, close this part of the webinar is that our MVI acknowledges that while SIDS have different determinants of vulnerability among themselves, they still come at the top in terms of vulnerability compared to the rest of the world. Our analysis shows that through the measurement of MVI, we have clarity as to where the SDG gaps come from, and some of the SDGs are prominently showing that. Our analysis also shows that resources to compensate for such structural vulnerabilities need to be distinct for the SIDS. We talk about distinct financing instruments, climate financing, economic development financing, but we also speak about, in general, concessional financing, as well as insurance and compensation mechanisms that would also help SIDS address their challenges. We thank you very much indeed and look forward to receiving your questions. Thank you, Anya, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simona and the team. Very much for a very interesting presentation. We will take questions during the question and answer session. Simona, so I'm hoping that the team members will stick around to handle the discussions. Thank you. All right, we're going to move straight on to the next set of presenters. Please, may I ask the UNESCO team to come on the screen, those who will be presenting, and without further ado, Zulmira, I'll hand over to you and the team. Please go ahead and introduce the various team members. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anya. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all, wherever you are. So my name is Zulmira Rodrigues, and I head the section for SIDS at UNESCO. And with me today, we will have Vladimir Ryabinin, our UNESCO Assistant Director General for the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. Vladimir, can you show your face, please? Then we have also Paola Leoncini Bartoli, our Director for the Division of Cultural Policies and Development. And we have Aurélien Dumont, our Associate Project Officer in the Division of Water Sciences and the Intergovernmental Hydrological Program, and myself. So first of all, on behalf of UNESCO, I would like to thank UNDESA and OSHA RLS for the opportunity to allow us to contribute to this important exercise. We have been listening to other presenters since the beginning of the webinars, and while we as an organization, we are not concerned with the financial aspects of development aid, we think that our multidimensional and multidisciplinary mandate and experience can add to these important discussions. So without further ado, allow me to start making the presentation. Perhaps Halisa, yes. So let me start with UNESCO's mandate and mission. So our mission is to contribute to building the culture of peace, the eradication of poverty, please go back, and promoting sustainable development and intercultural dialogue. And we do that through a variety of instruments. Our education sciences, being the natural, the oceans, and the social and human sciences, our culture sector, and communication and information. And this is our claim to say that actually we already, since our the start of the organization after the Second World War, we have been working on a multidimensional perspective. Now, when we were preparing to this webinar and also listening to other presenters, and we just listened to Professor Sachs and the colleague from Isabella, we came to a few conclusions that we felt were important to be reiterated. The first one is that while the MVI dialogue or the development of such an index is important to secure improved financial resource flows, it's also equally important to support better policy formulation and support. It is also important to highlight that as the previous speakers have highlighted, has said that there is diversity among SIDS, it is also important to acknowledge that there is, within SIDS, there is also internal diversity that needs to be taken into consideration. And while we are focusing on macro development issues, we should not forget why we are doing this. We are trying to support people, and in that sense, we should not lose from sight the people's element, and so look in particular to the most vulnerable ones. women, children, and youth. In addition, we also feel that we should take into account the interconnectivity between culture and nature. Culture systems cannot be understood, conserved, or managed without recognizing the human cultures that shape them. And together, cultural diversity and biological diversity will hold the key to ensure resilience in both social and ecological systems. And last but not least, vulnerability and resilience should be equally addressed in these deliberations, as in our view, they cannot be and should not be understood separately. Let me now start with the actual presentation and bringing you the perspective from education. As the previous speakers have spoken, we also are looking into three aspects of vulnerability, looking at the susceptibility to natural hazards, to geographic location and size, but also to the human and institutional capacity. Now, education is generally acknowledged to be a fundamental human right, but it's also an enabler for the attainment of all SDGs. And it is key for any country's ambition for social and sustainable economic growth and development. While being the custodian for education data in the world, indeed, as the previous speakers have reiterated, there is a limitation on data on SIDS. So the information that we are bringing to you today has been captured from the recent surveys and studies conducted also in the context of getting a better understanding on the impact of COVID-19 in the education sector. So if we look at the issue of the recurrence of natural hazards, education, this frequent occurrence of natural hazards implies that often education infrastructure is disrupted, and which obliges countries to repeatedly invest in reconstruction of schools and replacement of educational equipment. As a result, countries' capacities to invest in quality improvements are continuously challenged. The destruction of schools leads also to learning losses, and adding the fact that mostly schools are often used to shelter the displaced populations. We have seen that now in the recent volcano eruption in St. Vincent and Grenadines. This prolongs school absence, which sometimes can span months or even years. School closures do not lead only to education loss, but also to prolonged stays at home, which impact on the productivity, which affects women even more often because they are usually the main caretakers, but also increase the possibility of domestic violence and increase stress levels of both parents, children, and youth. And this has been very well evidenced with the current pandemic. Learning losses usually leads to increased inequalities, as the less economic viable groups have limited capacity to opt for alternative options of schooling, online, of relocation. And we saw that very strongly in the least developed countries in Africa, but definitely in the SIDS, that ministries had difficulties in putting online service at service of the out-of-school population because of this vulnerability. Now, going to the next one, we are going to look at the geographic location and size, and Professor Sachs and Isabella have referred that extensively to it. And indeed, the sea and the fact that many countries have multiple islands are themselves natural barriers for mobility, which besides increasing investments needs for education supply, it also reduces the capacity for provision of technical vocational training education and higher education services. This implies concentration of those services in mainland islands, or worse, obliging many to invest in overseas education, which is costly and tends to promote gender and economic inequality, as it prevents young women and the economically disadvantaged to pursue further their educational ambitions. Studying abroad as another disadvantage, as it likely increases brain drain, which in turn undermines the further human and institutional capacity development of the SIDS. To give an example, several Guinea-Bissau and other countries, over 50% of their students are obliged to study abroad. Now, the next factor is actually the human and institutional capacity in SIDS because of their size. So the limited human and institutional capacity, which is evidenced also in the inadequate availability of the data, hampers also the development of evidence-based policies. And as such, it jeopardizes the effectiveness of public investments and interventions. It also impacts on the capacity to provide for qualified teachers and education personnel, as well as to invest in teachers' professional development, which on its turn impacts on the quality of education. Teachers are often obliged to instruct in multiple grades and subjects, as countries have limited experience in applying open and distance learning solutions due to the considerable digital divide they experience. The Oxford Insights Artificial Intelligence Readiness Index indicates that aside from Singapore and Mauritius, most of the SIDS are ill prepared to engage in the 21st century technologies. So, and this is evidenced by the relatively low connectivity rate, as well as limited availability of devices and skills to engage in the digital transformation needed for education system to better serve remote and populations. Let me now pass to the next sector. So our social and human sciences, they deal mostly with the exclusion and and vulnerability of specific groups. So in today's increasingly diverse societies, UNESCO continues to accomplish every day its fundamental humanist mission to support people in understanding each other and working together to build lasting peace. UNESCO also helps to enable people to create and use knowledge for just and inclusive societies. In SIDS, support has been given in acknowledging the specific needs of young people. Young people constitute the majority of the population in most SIDS, and while their future and interests are largely at stake, they have minimal agency to influence their destinies. As such, acknowledging young people's challenges in SIDS that range from disadvantages in engagement in the labor market, which often leads to out-migration in the worst case, or to rural internal and urban coastal exodus, it's important. Young people are also often the victims of social exclusion and insufficient social protection, and their limited prospects leads also to school dropout, to early school dropout, or engagement in substance abuse or criminal activities. UNESCO works on youth, and with youth concentrates on building resilience to those vulnerabilities by investing in active engagement of youth in activism, their engagement in policy dialogue and research, as well as actively calling upon them for finding local level and national solutions through environmental education, sports, and anti-doping promotion. In addition, support is also given to countries to develop youth-centered policies. Several initiatives targeting youth are ongoing in different regions, meant to build their resilience as the youth as a researchers program focusing on the COVID-19, the sports and physical education.
I didn't mean legacy. He wanted to say he was yesterday chair for 7 years. But
I think
that what people have said, right? People basically say that he did not do a good job.
Dear Mr. Mitchell, could you please? Yes, thank you. The sports and physical education program, the anti-doping program, the youth science school, the Sandwatch program, and the youth visioning for Iceland's living initiative, which focus on mobilizing youth from SIDS in the policy debates around the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Let me now move to the next sector, which is equally important. which is the communication information sector. Now, this sector, UNESCO's work is focusing on building resilient and knowledge societies. It does so through a variety of angles. The first one revolves around strengthening freedom of expression and access to information. It supports equally the development of media capacities to cover key issues related to SIDS vulnerability, such as climate change, DRR, as well as the issues of misinformation and fake news, so clearly evidenced by the COVID-19 pandemic. Another program is centered around supporting countries to develop and implement policies to address the digital divide, the promotion of open solutions and 21st century technologies as artificial intelligence. And in addition, the CI program also focuses on encouraging multilingualism and cultural diversity in the cyberspace, each of them important for the SIDS. In doing so, UNESCO has developed several methodologies and tools that help us assess specific vulnerabilities of SIDS, and they include the media development indicators, the global media and information literacy assessment frameworks, the internet universality indicators, and the 1610.2 SDG indicator on public access to information. In addition, UNESCO supports countries in preserving their documentary heritage through the Memory of the World program, which is fundamental for SIDS given their particular susceptibility to natural hazards. I will stop here now, and I will then pass the floor to our Assistant Director General for the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. Vladimir, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zulmira. And you know, when I think about the diversity of UNESCO work, I think it's quite impressive, but I would like now to go a little bit deeper into a narrow subject that would show to you the specificity of SIDS and also some technical issues that deal with the disasters that may occur there. And I'm going to speak about the tsunamis. Tsunamis have not been mentioned yet today, despite there was a reference made to seismic hazards, but they are deadly. They are the deadliest actually natural hazards once they occur. They may occur not very often, but you know, once they do, this is a real disaster. And many SIDS in almost all regions, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, but except those who are off the western coast of Africa, are vulnerable to tsunamis. So the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO runs a tsunami warning and mitigation system. This is a highly technical system, you know, because we deal with seismic stations. We then determine the depths of the earthquake, the likelihood of generating tsunami, then we run models. It's a long story. But you know, the most important part of that story is the last mile. Because you know, if people do not get the notice, or if they get the notice but they cannot run, they cannot save their lives, then this risk turns into real disaster. So we have to study seismic vulnerabilities. We have to study and also recognize, and Professor Sachs mentioned this, that because of the sea level rise, because of the increased level of water simply, then the consequences of disasters may be even more developed because of the climate change and associated with the sea level rise. But once again, I'm going to move to social aspects of vulnerability of small island developing states. So I'm going to do it on the basis of 4 case studies. And you know, it's quite, I think, more than relevant that Simona Marinescu is with us, because one of these case studies is about Samoa. In 2009, there was a tsunami there. So, but tsunamis occur, you know, in many places, and I would like to use 4 studies, 4 cases of tsunamis. Some of them were warned about, some were not, like in Indian Ocean. And in Indian Ocean, it was exactly the reason why IOC was given that mandate to develop tsunami systems for the whole world. So 4 studies. Japan 2011, Chile 2010, Samoa 2009, and the famous Indian Ocean tsunami on the examples of Sri Lanka and Thailand. Next slide, please, Alisa. So, I would like to look at these graphs, and this show percentage of population by age groups in the islands, and now percentage of tsunami victims by the same age groups. And you will see that in the Samoa case, only 26 Samoans, population of Samoans are younger than 9 years, but 46 of percentage of victims are below 9 years. So kids are more vulnerable, and the same applies actually to elder generation. So we detected higher mortality of children and elderly in Samoa. So let's move then, just skipping the details because you need to know that, simply the substance of that, to the next slide. And the next slide shows gender vulnerability in relation to tsunami. If we compare all these 4 cases, then we will see that there are 48% of women in Samoa, but 60% of the victims were women. This relates to certain roles that they play, to gender dependency roles, but not only. And the thing is that, some of these conclusions are less intuitive than you may imagine. But anyway, we recognize that there is higher mortality due to gender roles. And also in Samoa and Sri Lanka, this depends on the profile of the country, the development profile. And this takes me to the last slide of my little piece. So I would like to conclude by saying that indeed we have more vulnerable proportions of generations. Why do we need this? Because we need to design escape strategies. And we need to know how to warn about tsunami if there is a tsunami after an earthquake, and then we have to really develop the system that will be saving maximum lives. And the non-intuitive part of this is, for example, in Japan, indeed, female mortality. In the case of Japanese Tohoku tsunami was not because of their kind of roles. It was related, surprisingly, to longevity of women in Japan on the coast of the island. So because of that, it relates rather to age rather than to the gender roles. So because of that, we are able to develop our tsunami warning system and also develop the program that is called Tsunami Ready. With that study, we will be able to understand better how to warn people and how to save their lives. I would like also to say that Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, the home of United Nations, Science in United Nations, is now running the Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. The focus on SIDS is strong, and I would like to say that in the course of that Decade of Ocean Science, we are going to develop a new generation of tsunami warning and mitigation system that will be more versatile, more technically savvy, but also take into account that social studies that we conduct as part of that exercise. I thank you very much for your attention, and now pass the floor to my dear colleague, Paolo Leoncini Bartoli.
Thank you, Vladimir. Colleagues, dear listeners, let me now shift you through another area of UNESCO's work, which is the area of culture. Now, recognizing the specific vulnerabilities of SIDS, particularly to global challenges such as climate change and the current sanitary crisis, UNESCO is working to protect and promote SIDS culture and heritage in all its forms and dimensions in order to build resilience and advance sustainable development. Slide 2, please, Khalisa. Thank you. SIDS are home to rich cultural resources that can help strengthen their resilience. SIDS are home to 34 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, ranging from cultural to natural and to mixed sites. World Heritage Sites are very important drivers of job creation in the SIDS. Let me add that according to the UNWTO, cultural tourism accounts for 40% of all tourism worldwide, just to have a global parameter. Tourism represents up to 50% of the GDP of some of the SIDS. SIDS are also home to many rich living heritage practices with 17 elements of living heritage inscribed on UNESCO's lists, which correspond to living intangible cultural heritage passed over from one generation to another. The cultural and creative industries equally are also a growing sector in the SIDS. According to, next slide, please. According to a recent UNESCO report, World Heritage Marine Sites, many of which are found in SIDS, comprise 15% of global blue carbon assets, which is equivalent to 10% of GHG emissions in 2018. However, SIDS also have specific vulnerabilities as regard to culture, and these are particularly relevant when it comes to culture. And as we listened earlier on from Isabella Manna on the MVI presentation, diversification of culture is particularly crucial in the SIDS content. Now, these vulnerabilities that are relevant to culture include climate change and natural hazards, as we heard, which threatens both cultural and natural heritage, as well as living heritage practices and local and indigenous knowledge. Secondly, global shocks and crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit cultural industries in the SIDS particularly hard and resulted in the interruption of living heritage practices. Thirdly, the over-reliance on international tourism made clear in the global halt of international travel due to the pandemic, which was global. According to the World Economic Outlook, which was just released in October last, the economies of tourism-dependent Caribbean nations, for example, are estimated to drop by 12%, while Pacific Island nations, such as Fiji, could see their GDP shrink by a staggering 21% in 2020. Fourthly, rural-urban migration and population loss results also in the weakening and loss of living heritage practices. Lastly, the lack of institutional capacity and funding for culture is also a major vulnerability for cultural and creative professionals in Pacific SIDS, for example, as they do not receive any dedicated government support. Next slide, please. To date, UNESCO has largely relied on qualitative approach to assessing SIDS vulnerability. In response to the impact of the pandemic on artists and cultural professionals, on their livelihoods, UNESCO has launched the Resiliart movement to sound the alarm on the impact of the crisis on livelihoods of artists and cultural professionals, and to contribute to the development of a set of policies and financial mechanisms to help them overcome this crisis. Thus far, over 270 debates have taken place in over 110 countries, including in 34 out of the 39 SIDS UNESCO member states. SIDS participants in these debates highlighted more particularly the need to reimagine festivals in the global south post-pandemic, the role of museums after the pandemic, and also the link between cities and the promotion of Caribbean visual and performing arts. In September last, the UNESCO office in the Pacific carried out qualitative assessment on the impact of the COVID pandemic on the culture sector as a whole in each of the 15 Pacific Island countries and territories. This assessment was particularly revealing as it showed substantial losses of revenues for the cultural and creative industries, budget cuts to cultural institutions, limited government support to cultural and creative sectors as part of the national economic support mechanisms. But it also revealed the strong contribution of culture, notably of living heritage, to social cohesion, resilience, and community well-being during the crisis. More generally, as part of the UNESCO World Heritage SIDS program, UNESCO is also monitoring and reporting on the state of the World Heritage properties in the SIDS every 2 years to its dedicated intergovernmental committee. Next slide, please. Going forward, UNESCO's Culture 2030 thematic indicators do provide a methodological framework to assess SIDS vulnerability in the field of culture. These thematic indicators measure ways in which culture is contributing to the implementation of all the 17 SDGs, putting to the forefront 3 of the 5 features that shape the SDGs: people, planet, and prosperity, through a set of 22 qualitative and quantitative indicators. It relies, this framework that you see on the screen, rely on a very pragmatic approach that is adapted to countries with limited statistical capacities precisely, which brings together existing data sources across different policy domains, from social and environmental to cultural and urban policies. As we all know that particularly in the SIDS context, culture pervades all the other development and policy areas. The Culture 2030 indicators do provide a conceptual and methodological foundation to assess different areas of social, economic, or environmental vulnerability identified for the SIDS, particularly those which are directly linked with culture, notably pertaining to cultural tourism, the impact of climate change on cultural assets, the vulnerability of cultural practices and know-how, in particular indigenous knowledge, the impact of rural-urban migration on culture and institutional capacity, and the funding in the field of culture, just to name the main ones.
Sorry, Paula, I'm
Yes?
going to have to ask the team to begin to wrap up now. It's 11 minutes past the hour, and we still have another presenter after you. So if you could please begin to wrap up, we'd appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you.
I just have one sentence. This framework of indicators does align to the Samoa pathway in order to strengthen the call for national disaggregated data and analytical capabilities for decision making. This framework is already rolled out in 14 countries, but no SIDS country so far. Thank you for listening. Over to you.
Thank you, Paula. Anya and colleagues, bear with us. We all have a final presentation, 5 minutes, on the importance of water for the SIDS. So, Aurelian, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So I would like to present some contribution now from the UNESCO Intergovernmental Hydrological Program and bring some inputs on the important link between water resources and vulnerability, and more specifically looking at the role of groundwater. This will be mainly done by presenting the result of the assessment of groundwater systems of SIDS that was undertaken under the Transboundary Waters Assessment Programs that was financed by the Global Environmental Facility between the years 2013 and 2016 and was implemented by UNESCO IHP. So as further background, I would like to remind that the size of the SIDS and the geological conditions imply that water availability and capacity of water retention, whether artificial through dams and reservoirs, for instance, or natural through groundwater and aquifers, are quite limited. In addition, also all islands are vulnerable to saltwater intrusion. SIDS that are reliant on small coastal aquifers are at higher risk of saltwater contamination, whether from sea level rise, pumping, or wave overwatch events. And this implies really multiple imbricated existing and potential vulnerabilities. For instance, vulnerabilities generated by the restricted water availability, the connection with salt water, as I was saying, but also demographic factors that create additional stress. So in addition to this more structural vulnerability, we have certainly water resources and groundwater that are themselves subject to high pressure in the SIDS context. And furthermore, this is also necessary to highlight the role of groundwater as emergency resource following disaster situation as an opportunity for recovery. Next slide, please. So without further delay, just a quick overview of the study that I was mentioning. So the main value beyond the results, the main conclusion that you have on your screen is to have identified a list of current state indicators and a methodology to populate them with a set of variables that can be replicated. So these indicators goes from the evaluation of the recharge of the aquifers per capita to human groundwater dependence and saltwater intrusion, for instance. And so this set of indicators was completed with more qualitative information in the form of hydrogeological profile with a focus on saltwater and freshwater interactions. So the indicators were estimated based primarily on preliminary data collection and a national expert survey. So this data is available and can be replicated. And the main conclusion of this study was that the majority of SIDS that are at risk of water scarcity, especially in low-lying islands, but also risk of pollution. So in the next slide, you can see more detailed visualization of the results, which help us to have a sense of how dependence to groundwater and the status of this specific resource is an element that contributes to vulnerability. And so you can see the level of vulnerability by the different colors, red, orange, or blue. And it appears in particular that population density is a critical indicator as it reflects a possible low level of resources availability per capita, and also this represents a direct driver for pollution. So I invite you to consult the report for more details. And the situation that emerged from this analysis calls for immediate attention, especially for low-lying islands in the Pacific, which are highly dependent on scarce, polluted, and growingly saline groundwater. In many other islands, degradation of groundwater quality and growing demands are posing short, medium-term threats to human health and impairing the provision of ecosystem services. And it is important to mention that the reduction of vulnerability goes through remediation of threats and pressure on groundwater resources, but can be done also by capitalizing on the full potential of these resources by developing sometimes untapped resources or investing in the protection of freshwater lands through techniques such as managed aquifer recharge, for instance. So on the next slide, you can see an example of what I was mentioning previously, the islands profile that was also formulated during this project, where the geology and numerous other information were collected and summarized. and especially with the visualization of the fresh water-saltwater interaction. So on the next slide, you have another example for now. And finally, the last slide, as a concluding points, and to go a little bit beyond the study on groundwater itself, some interesting reflection on the vulnerability can be drawn from the so-called nexus approach. For instance, if we reinforce water resources management and improve water resources availability, we have the possibility to develop irrigation, so contribution to food security. And I think one of the characteristics of SID is that there is a high connection between these different sectors, and at the end, a shock affecting, let's say, energy production can have immediate repercussion on other sectors, and without capacity to absorb these shocks, that would be in other contexts. So here, the interdependency is really key. And a final general reflection on the use of the MVI indicator would be that, of course, its usefulness to direct investment, but certainly it would be also worth to be able to dig into the vulnerability index to see its different building blocks and using them as a guidance to reinforce advocacy on several topics, even some technical topics such as the one I just presented. And noting that sometimes aggregating is losing information, but identifying areas of action request to have some level of details. So an important message to close is that groundwater vulnerability level has been assessed in this study based on several indicators, and there could have been certainly opportunity for replication and to add to the MVI. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much.
Zulmira, is that it?
Yes, that is it. We would like to thank you all for your attention, and we are ready for any questions may arise. Over to you, Anya.
Thank you very much, colleagues from UNESCO. And we're just going to go straight into our final presenter for this afternoon. Matthias, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So just as brief introduction, I'm Matthias Brockner. I work in the Secretariat of the Committee for Development Policy here in Dessau. And the Committee for Development Policy, or CDP, is an independent expert body of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. So I would like to thank my Dessau colleagues, first for inviting us, but then more so for setting up such an interesting and extensive webinar series on this topic of a multidimensional vulnerability index. I wanted to speak today, and I hope the screen can be seen, on some recent work of the Committee for Development Policy on measuring vulnerability. But just to highlight, as I said, it was said already in previous webinars, the CDP has a long history of working on vulnerability over several decades, and also has not worked only on measuring, but has also worked on policy recommendation on addressing vulnerability, including actually at one point in 2013 on addressing vulnerabilities of small island developing states. Just wanted to highlight that, as it's, I think, quite some of the conclusions derived from that work were very similar to the ones that had been heard earlier in this webinar from Professor Jeffrey Sachs. So today I wanted to briefly speak on three topics. First, on the Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index that has already been referenced several times in this webinar series. Then looking a bit on the impact of COVID-19 on this work. And then lastly, speak about a new product the Committee for Development Policy has developed on the so-called supplementary graduation indicators. So let's start with the Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index. You see here on the right-hand side, and I believe that had already been seen on some of the previous presentations, that's the latest incarnation of the Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index. It consists out of 8 indicators, 4 related to economic vulnerability, 4 related to environmental vulnerability. So the main focus or the main purpose of the EVI is that it's one of the 3 criteria that is used for the identification of least developed countries. And that indeed is a key mandate of the CDP. So it is in charge in making recommendations for those developing countries that should be assigned the status of as the least developed countries. As a least developed country. And that is done by purpose of 3 main criteria. That's the EVI, and in addition, there are 2 more. That's the Human Asset Index, HAI, and income, the gross national income per capita. And on this basis, it makes recommendations for inclusion and for graduation, because it's to be taken into account, let's say, different to the case of small island developing states. Being a least developed country is not a permanent status. We have seen it's difficult to overcome these challenges that make you a least developed country, but it is possible and it's not a permanent status. That's why both inclusion and graduation are important issues. I also wanted to highlight, we had many discussions in the webinar series, what to do with questions of social vulnerability in the context of the CDP work here. That's not so much of an issue because these many of these aspects related to social vulnerability and resilience are actually captured in the other criteria, particularly in the Human Assets Index. I would also like to highlight and come back to that later in the presentation that these recommendations that the CDP makes on the question of inclusion or graduation do not only rely on the criteria, they also rely on additional information. We've heard already about the vulnerability profiles that UNCTAD prepares before possible graduation. DESERT prepares impact assessments. Nowadays moving towards combining these vulnerability profiles and the impact assessments into broader graduation assessment, taking broader aspects into account. And most importantly, the Committee for Development Policy also consults with countries concerned before making recommendation. In addition to this primary purpose, the General Assembly had also invited development partners to use the LDC criteria among their criteria for allocating ODA. And I think in the first seminar, we heard a very interesting example how the Asian Development Bank is actually doing that. We have heard already the EVI, first covering only economic vulnerability, had been introduced in 1999. But it has been subsequently refined in 2005, in 2011, and in 2020. And the refinements were done for 2 main reasons: to reflect changes in overall development thinking, but importantly, also changes in data availability. And we'll come back to that, that is still a severe issue. There had also been specific mandates. For example, the latest revision in 2020 was the outcome of a multi-year review that had been explicitly mandated by the General Assembly and the ECOSOC. I would also like to highlight that changing vulnerability indices is not always an easy task, in particular if they are used for dynamic multi-year processes like questions of graduation, for example, from the LDC category, but also for other, that would also apply to other dynamic processes. Just briefly, what raised already, the main work of the CDP here is on vulnerability relates to LDCs. We have 8 SIDS among those, so 8 SIDS are also LDCs, whereas we see also it's a kind of distinct category as most least developed countries are actually nowadays in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's not only that the SIDS, there are few SIDS that are actually LDCs, also among those SIDS, they had generally been able, despite their vulnerabilities, to make quite significant development progress and are therefore advancing in the process on graduation. We have currently out of 46 LDCs, we have 16 countries that are already in various stages of the graduation process out of the LDC category. And out of these 16, 6 are actually small island developing states. And similarly, from the 6 countries that have already managed to graduate out of the LDC status, 4 of those are also small island developing states. And I wanted only to briefly give some reflections on the results. So these recommendations that the CDP is doing on graduation and inclusion are done in triennial reviews every 3 years. The CDP looks at all developing countries and to identify those that should be on the LDC list. And the most recent review had been done in February of this year. And we just recently posted the official data on our website. So you have here the link, and then you will see this further. But you can also just find all information if you go on cdp.un.org. In addition to this official data that comes every 3 years, the CDP, or we also publish a time series of the latest version of the Economic Vulnerability Index. That's actually something that is updated annually. And it is important, I wanted to flag this, because it's not possible really to compare these official EVI scores from different triennial reviews. And that's not only because there are these occasional refinements to the LDC criteria, it's also because data gets relatively frequently revised, also backwards, and there may also be changes in data sources or methodologies of underlying indicators. So therefore, we have this time series data also available. I wanted to highlight, so the data coverage there, it's all countries in developing regions, even though in fact the EVI one could also easily calculate for developed countries, but that's not part of the mandate here of the work for the CDP. This complete data coverage has been achieved mainly by selecting the indicators so that taking only those that is available for all countries. In limited cases, we also take then secondary sources into account, but that's more an issue of the Human Assets Index than for the EVI. If we look here at the progress over the past 9 years, based on this time series data, we see there had been only limited progress in reducing the vulnerability scores. You see we have more dots below this 45-degree line, meaning more countries have been able to reduce vulnerabilities than increase, but there are quite a big number that have also seen worsening vulnerability scores. We also see here that SIDS, also in the latest reincarnation of the EVI, are on average more vulnerable than non-SIDS. And similarly, we have those SIDS that are LDCs are also more vulnerable than SIDS that are non-LDCs. Even though there are obviously some exceptions, we also, similar to the results presented earlier in the first presentation today, we also find here that the most vulnerable SIDS and most vulnerable countries overall are those that are in the Pacific. With that, let me move to the next part on the impact of COVID-19. The CDP recently conducted a comprehensive study on the impact of COVID-19 on the LDC category, and that came out of concern by the CDP itself and as well by member states on the impact of COVID-19 on LDCs and on the triennial and also on this triennial review on the list of LDCs. So ECOSOC made a specific request. So the CDP made the study, and we used it for 2 purposes. One, it was an input for the triennial review. Remember that earlier said, in addition to the criteria, the CDP also considers additional information, mainly country-specific studies, but in this time it also looked at this comprehensive study, but it also used it to derive policy recommendations for other purposes. The study is also available on our website. You have here the link. So the main part of the study is on the review on really of the impacts of COVID-19 on the various LDCs, including those that are SIDS. But it also looks specifically at the linkages between COVID-19 and graduation, including on the links between COVID-19 and the LDC criteria. So would like to focus here and speak a bit on the impact of COVID-19 on the EVI. The first observation is relatively obvious, I believe. Impacts are not yet visible in the 2021 triennial review data like those that I had just shown a few slides before, because the available data for the triennial review only covers the period up to 2019. So therefore, all this impact of COVID-19 that were used for the triennial review were those that were included in this additional information, the country studies, the country consultation, and the specific COVID-19 study. However, for the next triennial review in 2024, the negative impact will be visible, and it will probably be visible also for many years beyond that. We look at the three criteria. The finding of the study was that the other two, GNI per capita and the human asset index, will probably be more strongly affected than the EVI, which I think can be explained with the fact that the EVI is probably the most structural of the three criteria. However, within the EVI, there's quite some variation. Export instability is the indicator that is most strongly, that will be most negatively impacted. But also of the others, we have the share of agriculture, fishery, and forestry in the GDP, and also agricultural instability, where some negative impacts can be expected, even though agriculture has only be limited impacts of COVID-19 seen. Then we have export concentration and remoteness. There may be some impacts because COVID-19 affected global trade, but the direction of the impact is not that clear. The victims of disaster, there's no direct impact here because the epidemiological disasters are not included here in the definition that is used. And in addition, we have two indicators, the share of population in low elevated coastal zones and the share of population in drylands that are not infected by COVID-19. But the overall conclusion in that study is that all LDCs, but that also holds for all other developing countries, are expected to have worse LDC criteria scores in the coming years compared to a non-COVID-19 scenario. And probably there will also be many countries that may see actually worsening absolute level of their scores. Wanted to highlight here briefly some work out of the study that looked specifically at export instability, because that's the EVI indicator that will be most affected most strongly. So it looks here at the horizontal axis, you have the 2021 export instability values. On the vertical axis, you have forecasted or simulated export instability values that combine existing observed values since 2002 and combine that with forecast on exports made by the IMF for the years 2020 for 2022. It's interesting to see, first, based on the simulation, some scores in absolute values may even go down, but that's not a sign that COVID has not negative impacts. That shows more that these are countries that had a high volatile export behavior in these earlier years between 1999 and 2002. But we see many countries have rising export instability scores, and this holds in particular for small island developing states, even more so for those that are non-SIDS than for those that are SIDS. The reason for that is probably relatively simple and had already been explained before. Most SIDS rely on tourism as their main export earning for export earnings, and tourism is the export sector that has been most heavily affected by COVID-19. Nevertheless, I believe, even though the reasoning is clear, the graph might illustrate that how SIDS will be affected in the context of the EVI looking forward. That brings me to the last part of the presentation on the supplementary graduation indicators. These have been introduced by the CDP last year in 2020 to complement both the official LDC criteria and the country-specific information in this additional information like the vulnerability profile. It has weaker requirements on data availability, but still aims to cover most LDCs as well as other developing countries. Importantly, it's an indicator set, not an index. It covers issues that are relevant for graduation, that's the name, but not necessarily requirements for graduation. And it's also a flexible tool that can be more easily kept under review and can be changed from one triennial review to the other. So the overall purpose of the SGIs is to cover vulnerabilities and relevant factors that may not be captured in the LDC criteria. Important to mention, not all of these factors would be labeled vulnerabilities, and more importantly, not all of the vulnerabilities may be labeled as structural vulnerabilities. So that distinction is kept within the LDC criteria, but not in this broader indicator framework. These SGIs are used as a screening device to identify discrepancies between criteria and broader issues, but also serve as an entry point for identifying priorities for managing graduation. And that's one of the main reasons why it's not an index, but a set of indicators, because only then it allows to highlight these are issues where a country compared to others may have may need to put attention on when managing graduation, and also where the international community may focus its assistance on. In addition, the SGI also improves the alignment of the graduation framework with the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, and may enhance the monitoring of graduated and graduating countries, which is another mandate of the CDP in relation to least developed countries. So here, briefly, this is a list of the current SGIs, or better, on the topics that are covered. You see here many of these indicators or issues are those that had been discussed in the previous weeks throughout this webinar series, whether it's debt, whether it's tourism reliance, whether it's ODA dependency, and so on, but also issues like digitalization, productive capacity, environmental vulnerabilities beyond those already captured in the EVI, but also factors that go beyond the LDC criteria framework on issues related to governance and peace and security. Would also like to highlight this SGI framework also allows to include some of broader complex indices by itself. For example, we had heard here last week on the Productive Capacities Index by UNCTAD. We have heard earlier this week on the Multidimensional Poverty Index. All these are just examples of some indices part of the SGI framework, but they wouldn't really fit into an index because they themselves consist of many indicators that are captured in other aspects of the LDC criteria or in other aspects here of the supplementary graduation indicators. Would like to highlight the SGIs. They are not available yet on our webpage. That will come some point in the coming weeks. For that, we have to make some more revisions to our website and to finalize some of the write-ups. The main part here is to visualize these in forms of heat maps. Here, just an extract looking at SIDS that are or have been LDCs in the past. So that's 14 in total. And the overall idea of the heat map is to use a reference point that corresponds to the share of LDCs in least developing countries, the share of LDCs in all developing countries, depending on the data availability, and then give color codes in order to highlight potential issues. Just to highlight, we see here those countries that are furthest, those SIDS that are furthest away, like Guinea-Bissau or Haiti. You see have more negative scores, more issues to be addressed, more areas of concern than those LDCs that are already further ahead in the graduation process. But we also see even those that have graduated, like Cabo Verde, Maldives, Samoa, and Vanuatu, also have persistent vulnerabilities. That's obviously no surprise for anyone in this seminar, because these vulnerabilities of SIDS are mostly persistent ones. I also wanted to highlight an issue that had been raised throughout the seminar series and came up again in the first presentation. Data availability is an issue, and this is actually particularly an issue for small island developing states. We have here many indicators there where we have data for most developing countries, but then those that are missing, most of them are actually small island developing states. Take here one, for example, would be adjusted net savings. That's related to the inclusive wealth index, the concept discussed by UNEP some weeks before. It's an issue, it's an important issue, but then for many small island developing states, there's unfortunately no data to that. I think that brings me to the end here, just some additional useful links on our websites related to the work where you find this data, but also analytical studies and some more specific information, particularly on least developed countries. So thank you very much. And with that, back